Alright, let me adjust this here some mediums. Alright, so this first part here is there's a couple slides that are gonna be, or a couple PowerPoints that are gonna be coming up here. And it's really more pharmacology focused. The interventions of medications and intro to pharmacology. And pretty interesting chapter if you get into it. This is from Pharmacology for Nurses, right? Ta-da! Okay, the purple book, and roughly it's just a summary of chapter 1 here. And what we're going to look at here is medication interventions and an intro to pharmacology, as I just said. So pharmacology, what is it and what does it consist of? Pharmacology is simply the study of medicine. It comes from the word, if you break it down, is pharmakon, which means medicine, and ology is obviously the study of. It consists of understanding a wide variety of minor subjects, okay? Understanding how a drug works, understanding what it does, where it works on the body. Those would be referred to like mechanism of action, okay? Its chemical name, adverse effects, side effects, signs and symptoms of those of indications like a renal failure or whatever have you. So I mean, pharmacology is the broad subject, and all the different pieces that go into it, really enrich it. Okay, medics and nurses are expected to know everything we can about it. Okay, before we give a drug to somebody, we have to know everything about it. Okay, so don't be surprised, like, if I start coming up to you and asking you, tell me about the side effects of ibuprofen. Okay, what happens if ibuprofen is taken for prolonged use? Well, you could say, well, specialist Haugen, if ibuprofen is taken for too long, it can cause gastric problems and ulcers in the stomach. And I say, good job, or different things like that. Okay, when not to take it. What is the active dose of it, etc. The full range of dose for an adult. Different things like that. Ibuprofen is one that you really want to know, because you have many a soldier that walks up to you and asks for ibuprofen, and you would want to ask them, how much have you had today? They'll probably say, oh, 4 or 5 pills, or something along that lines, and you may want to ask them, can I see them or see the bottle so you can see how much they've had, because too much can cause a lot of problems. Okay? But that's, getting into something more later on. It is a challenging subject, pharmacology, simply because right now there are roughly 10,000 drugs on the market right now. Okay? All of them with their own special quirks and everything else. And it can be very challenging to know all of them. And there are ways to getting to know them better, and we will look at those in time as well. Drugs do elicit different responses in patients due to a variety of factors. Okay, some drugs are affected by age, some by weight, their own sex, body composition. Sometimes drugs are affected by the disease processes in patients already there, because they'll be taking certain drugs for a disease process, but meanwhile you're trying to treat for a different one. Okay. Genetics is another one. Pharmacology and therapeutics, these two things go together. Okay, the definition of them is pretty much the same, except it changes a bit. Okay, therapeutics is that branch of medicine that really deals with the prevention of disease and the treatment of suffering. Pharmacotherapeutics is the application of drugs for disease prevention and treatment of suffering. Okay, so you have therapeutics, which is just that branch of medicine dealing with, how to prevent a disease, and the disease are there, so now we're going to treat it. Okay, pharmacotherapeutics is taking a drug and actually applying it to those two things. Classification of therapeutic agents. We have drugs. Simply right there, these are the chemical agent that is capable of producing responses in the body, biological ones. Okay. When a drug is given to a patient and it is administered, it becomes a medication. Okay. Biologics, these are like your hormones, your monoclonal antibodies, natural blood products, and those components. Okay, these are things that are naturally produced in human cells by microorganisms or by our own bodies. Okay. We also have complementary and alternative medicine therapies. Okay. They are also called CAMs. Okay. Which these are things that have been, they aren't really drugs or anything like that. They are alternative therapies, and these would include things like yoga, Reiki, the manipulation of energy to create healing, to bring about healing, okay? Hypnosis, acupuncture, massage, various treatments like cough and deep breathe. Um, those are just to name a few, alright? Herbal remedies, folk magic, or folk remedies, different things like that. Alternative practitioners, which we talked about with Reiki a little bit, you know. These are all things, they aren't, you know, they don't involve medicine per se. They involve natural healing products and those aspects of things. They have been shown to show promise in treatment, and they're more a lot of times they're more body-based practices, okay, and they are typically considered unconventional. Okay, so who regulates our drugs? Well, that's obvious. It's the FDA. Okay, now the FDA, first of all, just for your own knowledge here, the FDA wasn't actually a full functioning entity, okay, until 1988. Okay, you would think that something like that would be established, I don't know, way a long time ago, but obviously the good idea theory was not floating around at that particular time. Okay, what this administration does is it ensures that drugs are safe for the public use. That's it. Very plain and simple. They have trial processes. Sometimes they take up to about 7 years. They actually came up with black box warnings. And black box warnings are alerting providers and the public to this drug causes problems. Big time. Basically. Okay. You're actually, from the text here, they give the example of the COX-2 selective non-steroidal anti-inflammatory drugs. In other words, NSAIDs. They were evaluated during 2004 and 2005. Manufacturers of like Bextra and Celebrex and Vioxx, they were actually asked to revise their own labeling because there was a lot of concerns coming up about these particular NSAIDs. Okay, and they were like, no, I'm not going to do that. Well, here's the deal. If you don't put a black box warning on your product, the FDA said, we will pull it from the shelves and you will not sell again. That's what it is. And so they had to put it on there. People do not want a black companies do not want a black box warning on their product, but if they want to keep selling, they have to. You know what I mean? That's just the way cookie crumbles. So, and really what these were actually doing was the safety concerns were actually due to heart attacks, strokes, you know, some pretty big things, okay, and that needed to be known. So, some drugs we'll talk about here in a little bit can actually be fast-tracked, and the way that that is simply done is by looking at the benefit to precautions, you know, pros and cons, kind of thing, and if the drug can show substantial benefit over the precautions, like we've seen this like with the Ebola virus and the swine flu stuff and all that stuff, right? If the drugs can show that they have significant promise to treating a situation, for example, an emergency situation, they can be fast-tracked and move forward. Okay. However, you may find that when this happens, all the adverse effects start showing up sooner than needed to be, in problems and this and that and everything else. And so we find that maybe that's not the most effective way to go about things. But sometimes situations dictate a little differently. Herbal and dietary supplements. That's very interesting here. These actually can be marketed without the approval of the FDA. However, the FDA has not put their stamp of approval on it, and so that has to be put on the label along with all the information, the formulary, any adverse effects, and all this information is very closely monitored because the FDA has not put on their stamp of approval. That's the way it is. And it needs to be known that they haven't. Okay? If it doesn't have that on there, it gets pulled off the shelf. That's the way it is. Okay? It does not get marketed. And they are able to do that if necessary. They can do it immediately. And they're called recalls. So the phases of the drug process, there's 4 phases, and they're actually pretty extensive, and they're kind of interesting to read about. If you do decide to go into nursing, you never know, you might be a part of a research project of a particular drug, or the client might be a part of it, and we'll get into that when it gets to stage 4. But the first stage here is the preclinical investigation, and this is where you have all your extensive lab experiments on animals and humans and whatever else. However, the thing about testing on animals, okay, is that sometimes the drug can under or overestimate the effectiveness in humans. So this is where you get all your information from, how it works, what's it doing, is it exacerbating this condition, is it way out there as an adverse effect, is this working, is this therapeutic. It's a lot of touch and go, push me, pull me, see where we're going with this thing. It's really when you're starting to try and flesh out the process here. The next part is the clinical investigation, and this is actually the longest part of the whole approval process. Okay, this is where you get control groups of volunteers, and you determine the proper dosage. You assess for adverse effects. Okay, it's essential. Okay, because there are varying responses in different people. So you'll see these various control groups. Okay, and that's what they're doing, is they're seeing how it affects certain populations of people, and they're usually not very large groups, but they're enough where they can get a good sample. Okay. Well, let's see. This is where you can also fast track a drug. We talked about that. And also in this phase, the pharmaceutical company, is going to be developing a brand name for the drug. The third stage is the review of the new drug application. Okay, this is where the brand name is finalized. The FDA is actually permitted up to 6 months legally to initially review the NDA. If the NDA is rejected, the whole process is halted. Okay, until the company itself, not the FDA, not the company, goes back, addresses the whatever issues they found. Okay, this process can take up to 17 to 24 months. You may see more trials happening, animal testing may continue, and it's all dependent on what the prior steps of the process found. Okay. And finally, the last stage is the post-marketing surveillance. This here is where the drug is now dispensed and being used in the larger population, and this is where you will also start to see maybe even more harmful drug effects coming out. Okay, this is where you may also see a lot of black box warnings coming out. But point is, this is where now it's being dispensed to a larger population. Now it's being really analyzed and scrutinized in its effects of just the general populace. If you are part of any of these trials, or your patient is, part of any of these trials, you need to be the one to report things. You can report. They have a full hotline. You can call and be like, hey, my patient saw that, had this happen, da 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 da, or it's therapeutic. There you go. You know what I mean? So this is, it won't really affect merely us as medics so much. However, if those of you that are going into nursing or whatever, this is where you will find some of your practice being focused on. Again, some adverse effects can present later because you may not have anticipated any of it in any of the other investigations of the process, but now that it's out there in the large population, in completely different, they're not controlled groups anymore, it's just the population. This is where you may start to see a lot of them. This process has been adapted and changed over time, and that's simply because pharmaceutical companies are getting a little irritated that they're dumping all this money into research and development, and now the process is they have to get that money back, this is also why drugs are very, very expensive when they come out to begin with, and there is no generic variation of that drug. They get super expensive because they're trying to get that money back. Typical corporation. Okay. So what has the FDA done? The FDA has done that they are going to, they did this, I don't know, where's my timeline? They implemented the, where is it? The Prescription Drug User Fee Act in 1992. Okay. What that does is it says, hey, if you're going to use our process, basically, and if you're going to do this, you need to pay. You need to make a fee. And it has allowed the FDA to hire more people to speed the process along, to make it more effective. Okay. It has actually been estimated that $850 million, that's a lot of money. I can't even imagine to think about having that much money. Goes into getting a drug through the whole process and then out onto the market. So that is the synopsis of the whole process here. You can actually look in the book and you can find some a good timeline starting from 1820 when the U.S. Pharmacopoeia was established, and then it goes all the way up until they're still doing more, all the way up even now until 2011. And the most recent change there was, the Healthcare Reform Act, where the FDA, where law allowed the FDA to approve generic versions of biologic drugs. Additional drug rebates and benefits were provided to the American public. The FDA Food Safety Modernization Act actually came about, and that was actually the largest reform for food safety review since 1938. If you look through the whole timeline here, there was a lot that they did. There was a lot of experimenting, trying to figure out how they're going to be able to, modernize drugs and how they're going to try to regulate them. But isn't it just, and that's just a quick little food for thought there. Imagine it. They weren't able to come up with with a government entity. Okay. The Food and Drug Administration. The big umbrella thing, right? They weren't able to come up with that until 1988. That blows my mind. I don't know why, but it does. And then you'll notice that, like, more of the Bioterrorism Act, the FDA Amendments Act, Prescription Drug User Fee Act, and all these other ones. You know, it's pretty interesting if you want to actually start studying a little further into the history of pharmacology. So, there you be.